I was the Duke of Harrowmere, and men crossed the road to keep from meeting my eye. I had ridden down rioting tenants, faced a duel without blinking, buried both my parents before I was 30, and never let a soul see me grieve. Yet the only door that ever truly mattered in my life I slammed shut with my own hand, against the one woman who had done nothing under God's heaven but try to save what I loved. It has taken me 3 winters and a grave to understand what I threw away in a single afternoon of rage. Let me tell it plainly, the way she would want it told, without excuse. Her name was Rowena Blythe, and I bought her. I will not pretty the word. Her father was Squire Blythe of Fenwick, a soft, hopeful man who had mortgaged his acres to the Harrowmere estate one bad harvest at a time, until the whole of Fenwick and the roof over his 4 children belonged, in law, to me. My steward brought me the papers on a grey morning and said the family would be turned out by Michaelmas unless the debt was called good. I remember I did not even look up from my correspondence. Turn them out, I said. Debts are debts. It was my sister who stopped me. Sophie, 16 that spring, all impulse and warm heart, the one person in the world I could not refuse, burst into the library with her bonnet still on, and told me she had met the eldest Blythe daughter in the village and that I was a monster. I asked her dryly what she proposed I do with a monster's fortune, since I could hardly forgive a debt for every pretty face who wept in the square. She did not weep, Sophie said. That is why you should meet her. I met her a fortnight later, and Sophie was right. She did not weep. Miss Blythe came to Harrowmere Hall alone, in a gown that had been turned twice and pressed until the worn places gleamed, and she stood in my great cold hall as though she had come to negotiate a treaty rather than beg. She was 22, dark-haired, with a still, direct gray gaze that took the measure of a room before it took the measure of a man. She did not flatter me. She did not flinch at the mounted stags, or the long silence I let build on purpose to unsettle her. "You hold my father's debt, your grace," she said. "I have not come to ask you to forgive it. I have come to ask what you will take instead of my family's ruin." I confess it interested me, the flatness of it, the courage. I told her cruelly that I could think of nothing she owned worth the sum. "I own myself," she said. "That is all any of us truly owns. If a wife of decent birth and no expense to you would cancel the debt and keep the roof over my brothers and my sister, then I am for sale, and I will not shame you by pretending otherwise. I would rather be honest about the price than starve genteelly." I was 35, and I had never in my life heard a woman speak to me so. I should like to say I answered her with tenderness. I did not. I told her I had no use for a wife, that Harrowmere had a mistress's chair no one had warmed in a decade and I preferred it empty. And she inclined her head as though I had merely confirmed the weather and turned to go, and it was only at the door that she stopped and said, without heat, "Then my brothers will go to the workhouse, and you will not think of it again. That is the difference between us, your grace. You have the luxury of not thinking of it." She was halfway down the steps before I understood I had already decided. Why did I marry her? I have asked myself that through 3 long winters, and I can give you only the truth, which is that she made me feel, for the first time in years, that there was a person in the room and not merely a supplicant. I had lived so long behind my name that I had forgotten what it was to be spoken to as a man who could choose to be better than he was. She had shown me that man in the mirror of her contempt, and I found I did not want to lose sight of him. We were married 6 weeks later in the little gray chapel at the edge of the Harrowmere Park, with the sea booming below the cliffs and no guests but my sister, her father, and God. Sophie cried enough for the whole county. Rowena did not. She spoke her vows in a clear, low voice and looked at me steadily when she said them, and I remember thinking that I had bought a woman and been handed, instead, a conscience. I did not expect to warm to her. I had built my life on the principle that nothing could reach me that I did not permit, and I had permitted very little since I was a boy of 11, standing at my father's grave holding my baby sister's hand, understanding all at once that everyone who was supposed to protect me had gone into the ground and that I would have to become the wall myself. I became the wall. I was very good at it. Men feared me and women flattered me, and no one in 20 years got past the stone. Rowena did not try to get past it. That was the thing I had not braced for. She simply lived, quietly and thoroughly, in the house that was now hers, and let the stone alone. She began with the account books. Within a month she had found 3 years of my steward's small thefts, laid out in her neat hand, and brought them to me without triumph. When I asked, coldly, why she had not simply enjoyed a household that ran to her comfort, she said that a house that cheated its master would cheat its tenants first, and she had already been to 2 cottages that morning where the roofs the steward had charged me to mend had never been mended at all. She had a list. She always had a list. She went out among the Harrowmere people as no duchess before her had troubled to do. She learned the names of the tenants' children. She sat with the dying and read to the blind old weaver in the north cottages, and physicked the fevers that came up every autumn from the marsh. I heard of it second-hand from Sophie, who worshipped her, and from my valet, who did not dare say so but whose face grew easier when he spoke of her. I told myself it was nothing to me how she spent her days. I told myself a great many things that year. But the house changed. I cannot explain it better than that. Harrowmere had been a cold place, beautiful, vast, and cold, the way I liked it, and slowly it grew warm at the edges without my permission. There were flowers on the breakfast table that I had not ordered. The servants laughed sometimes in the passages, quickly stifled when I passed, and I found I did not mind. The walled garden, which had run to nettles and neglect since my mother died, filled with green again under Rowena's hands. I would come upon her there in the early mornings with dirt on her cuffs and her sleeves pushed up, and she would nod to me as to a neighbor, and go on with her digging. We did not speak of love. We spoke at first of very little: the estate, the weather, the state of the roads. But a man learns a woman across a long dinner table whether he wills it or not, and I was learning mine. I learned that she was funny, in a dry, quiet way that ambushed me, so that I would find myself laughing before I had decided to. I learned that she read late, that she loved her graceless younger brothers with a fierceness she showed to no one else, that she had a temper she kept on a very short leash, and a stubbornness she did not bother to leash at all. I learned that she was kind not because it was easy for her, but because she had decided, long ago and against every reason poverty had given her, that she would be. Kindness in Rowena was not softness. It was iron. And I learned, to my private astonishment, that I looked for her. I would find some pretext to ride out toward whatever cottage she was visiting. I began to time my breakfast to hers. When she was late one evening, a difficult berth in the south fields, and she stayed till dawn, I paced the hall like a fool and could not have told you why. And when she came in gray with cold, I wrapped my own coat around her before I knew my hands had moved, and she looked up at me, startled. And for one moment the wall was simply gone, and there was only the 2 of us in the guttering candlelight, and something passed between us that neither of us had the courage to name. Sophie named it, of course. Sophie named everything. "You're in love with your wife," she informed me, delighted, a year into the marriage, swinging her feet from the library table where she was not supposed to sit. "It's the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to this dreadful house. You should tell her." "I should throw you in the sea," I said. "You love her," Sophie sang, "and she loves you, and you are both too proud and too frightened to say a single word about it. And it is the funniest and saddest thing I have ever watched, and I intend to watch every minute." I told my sister she was an impertinent child, but that night I lay awake and turned the word over in the dark, love, and found it did not repel me the way it once would have. I thought that perhaps in the spring I might learn to say it. I thought we had time. I thought, God forgive me, that there was no hurry, that the years stretched ahead of us gentle and slow, and that a man who had waited 30 years to feel his own heart could afford to wait 1 season more. I have never since believed that time is a thing a man is owed. The fever came up out of the marsh that autumn worse than any I remembered. It began in the low cottages by the water, and it took the children first, as it always did, And by the second week 3 of them were dead and the marsh road was closed and the physician, Dr. Larkin, was riding himself half to death between the cottages and getting nowhere against it. I forbade Sophie the marsh entirely. I was blunt about it, the way I am about everything. The fever killed the young and it killed them fast, and I had buried enough of my family, and she was not to go near the water for any reason, and that was an order and not a request. Sophie, who had never in her life obeyed an order she disagreed with, said, "Yes, Adrian," and meant not one word of it. There was a child in the Marsh cottages, a little girl called Bess, the weaver's granddaughter whom Sophie had taught her letters. When the fever took the cottage where Bess lived, Sophie could not bear it. I did not know that then. I was in London. I had gone up on estate business, 4 days there and 4 days back, and I have cursed those 8 days every hour since. Rowena wrote to me that all was well. It was not well. It was the last calm before everything I had was taken from me, and I was 180 miles away, arguing with lawyers. Here is what happened while I was gone. I have pieced it together since, from Rowena, from Dr. Larkin, from the servants, from Sophie's own small hand. And I set it down now so that the truth I refused to hear for 3 years is written down at last, where I cannot pretend again that I did not know it. Sophie slipped out at dusk to take broth and blankets to little Bess alone, against every prohibition, telling no one. It was Rowena who found the note, a hurried, guilty line left on the schoolroom desk, and Rowena who understood at once what it meant. She did not send a servant. There was a storm coming up off the sea, the marsh road was a mire, and she would not risk another life on it. She took a lantern and a horse, and she went out herself into the rising weather to bring my sister home. She found her at the weaver's cottage, and she was too late to prevent the thing she had feared, which was that Sophie, sitting the whole evening at that fevered child's bedside, had breathed the sickness in. But she was not too late to save Bess, who lived. And she was not too late that first night to save Sophie either, not yet. She got my sister home through the storm, soaked to the bone, and she put her to bed and she sat with her. And then she did not leave that bedside for 11 days. I have this from Dr. Larkin, who came and went and could do nothing, and told me, 3 winters too late, the thing I had made myself deaf to, that in 20 years of practice he had never seen anyone nurse a fever as my wife nursed my sister, that she did not sleep, that she cooled the fever with her own hands through the worst of the delirium, when Sophie raved and did not know her and struck out at her and called for me, who was in London, and Rowena held her and answered in my name to comfort her, and never once left the room, that the fever on the 9th day turned and took hold of Rowena too, as it was always going to, because no one nurses that sickness so close and escapes it. That my wife knew she was ill, Larkin saw it, saw the flush and the tremor she hid, and that she said nothing, and did not take to her own bed, and went on nursing my sister with the fever in her own blood, because if she stopped there was no one else, and she would not let Sophie die alone. Sophie died on the 11th morning. She died in her right mind at the end, the fever having burned itself down to a terrible clarity, and she died holding Rowena's hand, and her last words Larkin heard them and wrote them down, though it was 3 years before I would let myself read what he wrote. Her last words were, "Don't tell Adrian it was my own fault. He'll never forgive himself. Tell him I wasn't afraid. You made me not afraid." And then she said, "Thank you for coming for me," and then she was gone. Rowena, half dead herself with the same fever, laid my sister out and closed her eyes and sent word to me in London. I rode through 2 nights to reach home. I want you to understand the state I was in. I want you to understand it, not to be forgiven for it, but so that you know that grief is a kind of madness, and that a man can do, inside it, things that no sane part of him would ever have permitted. I had raised that girl. I had held her at our parents' grave when she was 3 years old and I was a boy pretending to be a man. She was the one soft thing my whole hard life had left me, and I had gone away and left her, and I came home to find her in her coffin in the chapel where I had been married, and something in me that had held for 20 years simply broke. And into that broken, raving grief came a servant's frightened, half-heard, wholly wrong account. It was a scullery maid, a girl of 15, terrified out of her wits by a duke gone white and wild in his own hall, demanding to know how his sister came to be in the marsh at all. And the girl, wanting only to give an answer that was not "I don't know," stammered something about the mistress and the marsh, and the lantern going out into the storm, meaning, of course, that the mistress had gone to bring Lady Sophie back. But I did not hear it that way. I heard, in the ruin of my mind, that my wife had taken my sister to the marsh, that the one prohibition I had laid down to keep Sophie safe had been broken, and broken by the woman I had married, the woman who went among the fever cottages, the woman with her lists and her nursing and her endless traffic with the sick and the dying. I had told her, I was certain I had told her, to keep Sophie away from the water, and Sophie was dead. I did not ask Rowena. That is the whole of my crime in one sentence, and I will not soften it. I did not ask her. I found her in the sick room, gray and swaying, her own fever not 3 days broken, holding herself upright by the bedpost of the bed where my sister had died, and I did not see a woman who had nearly given her life for mine. I saw the person my grief needed to blame, because grief cannot survive without something to blame, and I could not blame Sophie and I could not blame God, and so I blamed the nearest living soul, and it was the one who least deserved it in all the world. I said terrible things. I will not write all of them. Some of them I cannot bear to see in ink even now. I said that she had killed my sister. I said that I had never wanted her, that I had bought her out of a moment's weakness and regretted it from the first, that the marriage had been a mistake and this was its price. I said I could not bear the sight of her. I told her she would remove herself from the hall to the dower house within the hour, and that she would keep from my presence, that we would remain married because I would not give the county the scandal of a divorce, but that I would live and die without looking at her face again. And through all of it, through the whole storm of my cruelty, Rowena Blythe did not weep. She stood there, gray with the fever I did not even see, and she looked at me with those steady gray eyes, and when I had finished she said very quietly only this: "You are grieving. I will not answer you now. But you are wrong, Adrian, and one day you will know how wrong, and I pray to God you are able to live with it." Then she gathered what little was hers, and she walked out of my house in the November rain, still ill, to the cold dower house across the park. And she did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not tell me. She never told me, not for 3 years, that the fever she carried out of that sick room had nearly killed her too, and that Dr. Larkin had sat up 2 nights with her in the dower house expecting her to die, and that she had lived only because she was made of iron, and had turned her face to the wall and lived out of sheer stubbornness because her brothers still depended on the settlement, and because, she told me long after, she would not give me the satisfaction of being right about the cost of what I'd done. That was how the 3 winters began. I have to tell you now about the silence, because the silence was the true punishment, and I built it myself, brick by brick, out of my pride. We lived, the 2 of us, on the same estate within a half-mile of each other for 3 years, and we did not speak. She kept to the dower house and the walled garden and the cottages of the poor. I kept to the hall. When estate business required a decision that touched us both, it passed through the steward or through letters, cold, formal letters, "Your Grace" and "Madam," the correspondence of strangers who happened to share a name. If we met by chance on the park road, she inclined her head with perfect courtesy and passed, and I inclined mine and passed, and the not speaking was so total and so practiced that the servants stopped remarking on it, and the county forgot there had ever been a marriage at all. I told myself it was justice. I told myself she had killed Sophie, and that I was merciful not to have cast her out to starve. I told myself I was a wronged man nursing a righteous grief, and I wrapped that grief around myself like the old stone wall, and for a while it held. But grief that is built on a lie is a house built on sand, and mine began to shift almost at once, in ways I would not look at. because I could not stop watching her. I who had said I would die without looking at her face. I found myself at the library window in the mornings, looking for her in the walled garden. I found excuses to ride the park road at the hour she went to the cottages. I heard, though I forbade the servants to speak of her, every scrap of news of her, that she had nursed the whole marsh through the next autumn's fever and taken not one payment for it, that she had schooled the tenants' children through the winter when the parish could not. That old Marsh the weaver, when he died, had asked for the young duchess, and not the parson, to sit with him at the end, and she had come and stayed the night. The Harrowmere people loved her. They did not love me. They feared me, which I had always thought the same thing, and slowly, across those 3 years, I learned from watching my wife that it is not the same thing at all. And I could not square it. That was the crack that widened. A woman who had killed my sister out of carelessness or cruelty, I could hate that woman cleanly. But the woman I watched from my cold window was not careless and was not cruel. She was the most careful and least cruel person I had ever known. She was a woman who gave her whole self, day after day, and asked nothing, and never complained, and never, this was the thing that began to torment me, never defended herself. In 3 years, she never once wrote to me to plead her case. She never sent a friend to intercede. She never used Sophie's memory against me, though she of all people had been there and I had not. She simply endured, in perfect silence, the sentence I had passed, as though she had decided that my forgiveness was not a thing worth begging for from a man who could withhold it so. There is a particular horror in being forgiven nothing because you have been asked for nothing. I began to understand it in the second winter. There was a morning, I remember it exactly, when I rode out early and came upon her in the little gray chapel where we had married and where Sophie was buried. She did not hear me. She was kneeling at Sophie's grave, and she had brought the first snowdrops of the year, and she was speaking to my sister, lo, the way you speak to someone you have not stopped loving. I stood in the chapel doorway unseen, and I heard her say, "He still won't come to you, dearest. He comes when I'm not here. I see the fresh flowers, so I've started coming early so as not to keep him away. Silly, the two of us, tending the same grave and never at the same hour." And then she said, "I keep my promise. I never told him it was your own fault. I never will." And she touched the cold stone, and she rose, and I stepped back into the shadows so she would not see me, and I let my own wife walk past me out of that chapel not 3 feet away, and I said nothing, because if I had opened my mouth I did not know what would have come out. It was your own fault. She had said it to a gravestone. She never told him it was your own fault. I told myself I had misheard. I told myself a great many things in those 3 winters. I was very good at it. But a seed had gone into me in that chapel doorway that no amount of pride could kill, and it grew all that second winter, slow and terrible. The suspicion that I had built my grief on a lie and that I was living in the house of it, and that the woman I had condemned had been keeping, out of some fierce and private loyalty, the very secret that would have set her free. I did not go to her. Understand my cowardice. By then, to ask would have been to risk learning I had been monstrous, and a man who has spent 2 years being righteous cannot easily become a man who was only cruel. My pride had grown around the lie like bark around a nail. To pull it out would tear the whole tree, so I did not ask. I chose, deliberately, not to know, and I went on not knowing for another whole year, and I have to live with the fact that a full year of the little we had left, I burned on the altar of not wanting to have been wrong. The truth, when it came, did not wait for my courage. It never does. Dr. Larkin was an old man by the 3rd winter, and the same lung rot that he had physicked in 100 marsh cottages came for him at last, and he knew he was dying, and he was not a man to go to his own grave carrying another man's error. He sent for me. I went to his cottage on a raw March evening thinking he wished to settle some account, and I found him propped up in his bed, breathing like a bellows, and he looked at me with the flat, unfrightened eyes of a man who has nothing left to lose and said, "Sit down, Your Grace. I have something to tell you, and you are going to hate me for it, and I find at the end of my life I do not care. And then he told me everything. He told me about the note on the schoolroom desk, and how Rowena had gone out into the storm herself rather than risk a servant to bring Sophie home. He told me about the 11 days. He told me, and here his old voice, which had gone flat and clinical through the rest, cracked at last, about the 9th day, when he had seen the fever take my wife, and how she had looked at him and put her finger to her lips and gone on nursing my sister with death already in her own blood, because there was no one else, and she would not let the child die alone. He told me Sophie's last words, and he took from the table beside his bed a paper folded small and soft with handling, 3 years old, on which he had written them down that same morning, and he made me read them. Don't tell Adrian it was my own fault. He'll never forgive himself. Tell him I wasn't afraid. You made me not afraid. And under it, in the doctor's own hand, these were the last words of Lady Sophie Vane, spoken to Her Grace the Duchess, who never left her, and who I believed that night would follow her into the ground within the week. She nearly died, Your Grace, the old man said. In that cold dower house you sent her to, sick to death. 3 nights I sat up sure I would be burying 2 of the family and not one. She lived because she is the strongest soul I ever attended, and because she told me this herself in the delirium, and I have never repeated it till now, because she would not, she said, die and let you go on thinking you had been right. He drew a wet, ragged breath. I should have come to you 3 years ago. I am a coward, and I told myself it was not my place, and I have watched 2 good people rot in a silence I could have ended with a sentence, and I am dying, and I will not carry it any further. Now you know. God forgive you for what you do with it. He'll have an easier time than I would. I do not remember leaving the doctor's cottage. I remember the cold, and the sea sounding under the cliffs the way it had sounded on my wedding day, and I remember standing in the dark of the park with Sophie's last words crumpled in my fist, and understanding, all at once and all the way down, the size of what I had done. I had not merely wronged an innocent woman. I had taken the person who had loved my sister enough to die for her, who had in fact nearly died for her, who had held my Sophie through the horror of it, and answered in my name to comfort her because I was too far away to come. I had taken that woman, 3 days out of her own deathbed, and I had called her my sister's murderer, and I had cast her into the cold, and I had left her there for 3 years while she tended my poor, and blessed my sister's grave, and kept my sister's secret to spare me a guilt I had not even the grace to feel. She had spent 3 years protecting me from the truth, and I had spent 3 years despising her for a crime that existed only because I had been too proud and too broken to ask a single question. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark of the library where Sophie used to swing her feet from the table, and I read the doctor's paper until I had it by heart, and somewhere near dawn I stopped being able to hold the wall up, and it came down, all of it, 20 years of stone, and I wept as I had not wept since I was 11 years old at my father's grave. I wept for Sophie. I wept for the 3 years. And I wept, most of all and most uselessly, for the woman across the park whom I had truly had, in that one warm year before the fever, the flowers on the table and the coat around her shoulders, and love almost said, and whom I had thrown into the dark with my own 2 hands. In the morning I went to her. I will tell you how it was, because it is the only part of this that I am not ashamed of, and even that is small enough. It was early and gray, and I knew where to find her because I had spent 3 years watching where she went. She was in the walled garden at the dower house, on her knees in the cold spring earth, her sleeves pushed up, planting. She was always planting, always tending some living thing back into being, and she heard the gate and looked up. And when she saw that it was me, a stillness came over her, wary and unreadable, the courtesy she had worn like armor for 3 years already rising into her face. And I could not do the things a man is supposed to do. I could not walk to her and make a graceful speech. I got as far as the middle of that walled garden, and I looked at her chapped hands and her dirt-stained cuffs and her steady gray eyes, and the small mark the fever had left at her temple that I had never once let myself see. And everything I had prepared to say went out of me, and I did the only true thing I have ever done in my life. I went down on my knees in the cold earth in front of my wife, the Duke of Harrowmere, before whom men crossed the road, and I could not speak for a moment, and then I said, "I know what you did. Larkin told me. I know all of it. I know you brought her home through the storm. I know you never left her. I know the fever took you too and you hid it. I know you nearly died in that house I sent you to. I know she told you it was her own fault, and I know you kept it 3 years to spare me. I know everything I refused to ask, and I have no right to be kneeling here, and I have no right to your face, and I have less than no right to what I am going to ask you for, but I am going to ask it anyway because I am done at last with pride." My voice went. I let it. "Forgive me, Rowena. I have nothing to offer you but the whole rest of a ruined man's life, and I know it is not enough, and I am asking anyway. Forgive me." She did not answer at once. I want to be honest about that too, because it matters. She did not fall into my arms. She did not weep and pardon me and let 3 years dissolve as though they had never been. She had more dignity than that and more truth in her, and I had taught her, God knows, the price of taking a man on trust. She sat back on her heels in the earth, and she looked at me for a long time, long enough that the sea was the only sound, booming below the cliffs. And when she spoke, her voice was low and even, and it did not tremble. "Do you know," she said, "what the worst of it was? It was not the words. Grief makes men cruel, I knew that. I forgave the words within the year. It was that you never asked. In 1 whole year of a marriage I thought I let myself think had become something. You learned enough of me to know I could not have done what you accused me of. You knew me, Adrian, and you did not ask. You looked at me across your sister's coffin and you decided you already knew, because it was easier to have someone to hate than someone to grieve with. That is what I could not forgive for 3 years. Not that you were cruel, that you did not think me worth a single question." "I know," I said. "I know it. There is no defense. I am not offering one." "I nearly died," she said, still steady. "In the dark, alone, in the cold. And I lay there and I decided I would live, and do you know why? Not for love of you. I had no love left to spend on you that winter, but out of pure spite, because I would not let you be right. That is what you made of me. You took a woman who tended the dying out of kindness, and for 1 winter you made her live out of spite. I have never told anyone that. I am telling you now so that you understand exactly what you did, since you are so fond this morning of knowing everything." I bowed my head. There was nothing to say. I had asked for the truth, and here it was, and it was worse than I had let myself imagine, and I deserved every word. And then I heard her shift in the earth, and her hand came into my sight, dirt-stained, chapped, steady, and it rested on the crown of my bowed head, light as a benediction, and her voice changed. And I heard in it, for the first time in 3 years, the woman from the warm year, the dry, fierce, iron-kind woman I had thrown away. "But I am not spite, Adrian," she said. "I decided that too that winter once I had lived. I decided I would not let you make me small. Kindness is not softness. I have known that since I was poor and proud in a turned gown. It is a thing you choose again and again, especially when it is least deserved, especially then." Her hand pressed gently. "Look at me." I looked up. Her gray eyes were wet at last, the first time in 3 years I had seen it, and I understood it was a gift and not a weakness. And there was no armor left in her face, only a great and terrible and living tenderness, the more terrible for all it had survived. "I loved you," she said. "In that year I loved you, and I have hated you, and I have grieved you like a death, and I have knelt at your sister's grave every morning of 3 winters keeping your secret, and yes, God help me, I have gone on loving you underneath all of it, the way you go on loving a thing that has broken your heart, because the heart is a stubborn fool and mine was made stubborn young. I do not forgive you because it is easy. It is not easy. I forgive you because I have spent 3 years watching what an unforgiven grief does to a soul, and I watched it in your face across a park for 3 winters, and I will not become that. I would rather forgive you and be wrong than guard my hurt and be right. That is the difference between us, Adrian. I always could afford to think of it. You are only learning. I took her hand, her cold, chapped, miraculous hand, and I pressed it to my face, and I could not speak, and she let me hold it there in the cold earth of the walled garden while the sea sounded below us, and she said at last, very softly, "Get up. You'll take a chill, and I have buried enough of this family." We did not go straight back to the way we had been. I want that written down too, because the county tells it as a fairy tale now, the Duke and his Duchess, the great cold hall gone warm, the flowers on the table again, and the fairy tale leaves out the work. Forgiveness is not a door you walk through once. It is a garden you tend, morning after morning, on your knees in the cold, and some mornings nothing grows and you go out and kneel again. We began again slowly, as two people who had wounded each other too deeply to trust the quick word. She came back to the hall not that day nor that month, but in her own time, when she was ready and not before. And I learned, I who had never in my life waited for anything, to wait, and to ask, and to keep asking, because I had learned at last that the not asking was the whole of my sin. We went together, the first morning she was ready, to the little gray chapel, and we knelt at Sophie's grave at the same hour, the two of us, and I read my sister's last words aloud for the first time, and Rowena held my hand while I did it, and I told my sister, 3 years too late, that I was not afraid either, that her sister-in-law had taught me too. And Rowena wept, and I wept, and something was buried that morning that should have been buried 3 winters before, and something else, small and green and stubborn, began to grow. She lived to be an old woman, my Rowena. We had our years, more years than I had any right to, warm years, the walled garden full and the house full, and her graceless brothers grown and prospering on the settlement she had bought with herself in my cold hall when she was 22 and afraid of nothing. I told her I loved her 10,000 times to make up for the once I did not say in time, and she would roll her eyes at me and say I was making up for lost ground, and she would not be flattered, and then she would take my hand. She is gone now. I am the old man in the great hall, and I tend 2 graves at the same hour every morning. I no longer hide from anyone which hour I keep. And I have written this down so that it will not be lost, so that whoever comes after will know that the Duke of Harrowmere, whom men feared, was saved by a debtor's daughter he bought and wronged and did not deserve, and that she taught him the only thing worth knowing, which he was too proud to learn any younger. Kindness is not softness, it is iron. It is the choice you make again and again, especially when it is least deserved. Especially then. She forgave me. I will spend whatever is left of me being worthy of it, and I will not finish, and that is right, and I would not have it otherwise.